that mask, slips, or that I start wrestling with it and trying to take it off and feeling conflicted about presenting that face to the world.
Hello, my friends. Today's episode, I am inviting you into a conversation with a good friend of mine from high school. His name is Adam Mansbach, and it's not fair that I am introducing him that way because he actually is an extremely accomplished novelist, author, screenwriter, and self-proclaimed cultural critic. He is a phenomenal human being who I refound after 25 to 30 years because he wrote a new book called I Had a Brother Once. It is a memoir in verse speaking of the death of his brother who took his life almost 10 years ago now. And in this conversation, we talk about suicide, talk about losing our brothers, and talk about how this has affected Adam in terms of his pursuing his dream, in terms of really reaching for his own purpose in life and what has happened over time for him to take off that mask and show some vulnerable sides of him and how that catapulted him in terms of his success. So I hope you enjoy this episode. Hello and welcome to the Business of Happiness podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Tarryn MacCarthy, and today is going to be an excellent day because we are joined by a friend of mine, New York Times best-selling author, award-winning novelist and screenwriter, and self-proclaimed cultural critic. He's best known for Go the Fuck to Sleep, Rage is Back, The End of the Jews, and one of my personal favorites, Angry Black White Boy. And what's really fascinating is this incredible human who we're about to hear from is a friend of mine from high school. So this is a surreal experience for me. I don't think we've seen each other in maybe 25 years. So I'd like you all to join me in welcoming the one and only Adam Mansbach. Welcome.
Hey, good to see you.
Thank you again for doing me this honor and for joining us. And I left out one of the big reasons why I invited Adam to join us on the Business of Happiness podcast. And that is because he has just written a phenomenal new book, a memoir in verse, if you will. And the title is I Had a Brother Once. And I have to say, Adam, I ordered this book on Audible with the intention of consuming it as quickly as I could before our conversation. And I'm so glad I did because I've never listened to a memoir in verse before, but it was phenomenal. It was so beautiful to hear you speak it in the cadence you had intended, and the music and the soundtrack in the background. It was really, really well done. Thank you for that.
Thank you. Yeah, that was the music is by an old friend and longtime collaborator of mine, a guy named DJ Frayne, who I've done book tours with. He's a producer, a turntablist, a keyboard player, and a very sensitive listener. And one of the few people I would have trusted to soundscape this. We had like one conversation about it, and then he just went and did his thing, and I didn't hear it until it was over. And I thought it was great.
That's awesome. Did you speak it to the music, or was the music laid over on top?
The music came after. I was in a studio just laying it down. Which is an unusual way to combine vocals and music. I mean, typically you would want to be interacting with the music. But in this case, I think we were clear on the idea that he wasn't going to be like, dropping beats every 5 seconds. It was going to be a lot of sort of backgroundy and ambient sounds and that kind of thing. So I felt like it actually made sense in this case for him to work off of what I did, and as you say, the cadence and all of that, rather than me trying to calibrate what I was doing to the soundtrack.
Yeah, it was awesome. I love the beginning of just when you were in the car driving, and you can feel kind of the excitement and the adventure of the evening for you before you got the big news, which we'll talk about. But I loved the music in the background, put me right there with you. I'm so glad that you decided to do it that way, because it really it was a great experience in terms of an Audible. I'm so glad I did that because I usually love having a book in my hand, and I just for timing purposes, I downloaded it on Audible, but I'm so glad I did. Did you intend for people to listen to this book?
Well, I certainly intended it for it to exist on the page as, something. Yeah, I mean, I wrote it as a book, but I did certainly before the pandemic hit have ambitious plans about how I wanted to tour it and how I wanted to perform it. And the audiobook is a pretty good representation of what I had in mind. I did want to be in like theater spaces, performance spaces. The book, as you say, is short and it lends itself to being read or consumed or listened to all at once. So I did have these notions that I would be up there, in front of crowds with some visual stuff, like some projections, and some audio cues, and at least a few times, not necessarily like 30 cities worth, but a few times at least do the whole book. But of course, when I sat down to record the audiobook, I was like crying and choking up and like sobbing my way through it, which is a lot to ask an audience to go through with you. So it may be in some sense for the best that we committed it to tape and people can listen to it in that way. I don't know if an audience needs to hear me like, struggling my way through all the emotional turns and twists of the book in the way that would probably occur if I was on stage doing it. Yeah. And on the flip side, I don't know how I would feel if I performed it enough times that it no longer affected me in that way. That would also be problematic for me in a different way.
If it became a performance.
Yeah. If it no longer felt raw enough to me. I mean, I'm performing little bits and pieces of it when I do events. I try to pick different ones. Last night I had an event and I read a part over Zoom that I'd never read aloud before. And and I could barely get through it. And I was like, okay, good to know, good to remember that that's still the case.
Yeah.
So yeah.
That's interesting. So for our listeners' sake, this book is about your brother, your real brother, who took his life 9 years ago. Is that what it is now? 9 years ago? 10 years ago. 9 when you wrote the book.
8 when I wrote the book, because the machinations of publishing are such that there's a lot of lag time sometimes between the creation of the book and the publication of the book. And in this case, it got pushed back because of the election, because of the pandemic. So yeah, I wrote the book almost 2 years ago.
So number one, why did you want to write this book? Why was this a dream of yours? And number two, why did it take you 8 years to write?
I don't think I ever stopped thinking about writing about my brother, his life, his death, what I went through. But it took me a long time to figure out how to approach it, how to get there, like emotionally, and have enough perspective and distance to be able to talk about it. But also on a craft level, I was very much stymied by not having a grasp on what the form of the book would be. The architecture, the scaffolding, all of those things kind of stopped me before I started for many years. I'm a novelist, so I tend to think first about that form. And I did, and I could never figure out what that would look like. What the process of turning the book into fiction and structuring it into a story would be, what I would be doing with the characters, the narrative, the plot. So I put, it's like, okay, so maybe it's a long essay. I write essays sometimes. What form does that take? Couldn't figure it out. I never put anything on paper except for maybe 2 pages of a screenplay at one point. Didn't get any farther than that. And I stumbled upon this form, and it was very liberating, and it allowed me to go ahead and write the book. I've always written poetry. My first book ever is a book of poetry, but none of my books since has been a book of poetry. And that was like 20 years ago. But it so happened that my friend Mark Bamuti Joseph commissioned me to write a piece for an event that SF Jazz was doing, San Francisco Jazz was doing. And it was going to be a bunch of writers performing with a jazz band. which put me immediately in the mind state of poetry, because you want, in that context, you want the words to sing and swing with the band. So I wrote an elegy for Fife from A Tribe Called Quest, who had recently died, which, hit me in a certain kind of way. It's a group I grew up listening to, have always continued to listen to. I know Q-Tip a little bit. That death was one of many in hip hop that has been resonant for me. Unfortunately, there have been many. So I wrote the piece, and then I spent the week performing it with this excellent band. And that in many ways took me back to many connected like comfort zones. I used to perform with bands a lot. I was a roadie for a jazz drummer for many years, Elvin Jones, John Coltrane's drummer throughout the 60s, probably the greatest drummer who ever lived. So being in jazz clubs is very familiar, very comfortable. Being around jazz musicians is very familiar, very comfortable for me. And a lot of these poets also happen to be folks that I love as people and as poets. My friend Lauren Whitehead, a guy named Tongo Eisen Martin, my friend Jeff Chang. So I came off of this kind of week of performance high, and it happened to be the week that my brother would have turned 40. So I kind of carried that reawakening of the love of poetry, the memory, the re-realization that poetry at its best could be extremely powerful and potent and liberating as a form. And I just got to work. I sat in this room that you see me in now, which is my writing studio, which is, filled with records and books. And I just kind of locked myself in here and listened to music and started writing. And poetry allowed me to move very quickly and freely from scene to scene and idea to idea with a minimum of connective tissue, a minimum of scaffolding. The architecture is very simple. You can connect things in poetry simply through proximity. Just by putting one thing next to another, a certain kind of connection is made. And it allows you to cover ground quickly, and it allowed me to kind of push off from the shore very quickly and feel like I was pretty far out pretty fast. Like when you're writing short lines and breaking those lines frequently, as I do in this book, like these are short lines, my line stays short. You feel like you're covering ground fast, and you can look back, after a day of work or 2 days of work and be like, shit, I got 20 pages already. And, in a sense, I mean, the book only took me 3 weeks to write. But in another sense, it took me like 8 years and 3 weeks to write. There was a lot that I already knew that found form and found voice on the page, but I was also very much engaged in a process of discovery. There were connections I made in writing this book,
Interesting,
things I put together that I had not done until I sat down and started writing, like ideas that coalesced and notions and connections that really for me only came together in the writing. So that was, so it was a very intense process for me, a very intuitive process. I didn't always know where I was going or why something was going to connect, but I just kind of went with it, and it always did. And I was just writing like to the exclusion of all else. I've never really engaged in a writing process quite like this one. I didn't do a lot of like high quality parenting during this time. My partner didn't see much of me. Like I was just really in this room going through it and going in.
That's fascinating. You brought up a couple things that I want to touch on. Number one was you mentioned how the book kind of carried you through, and the verse carried you through and pushed you forward. Do you think that helped from an emotional standpoint in terms of being able to just continue to keep going, like almost like it was able to support you through the process in terms of the pace that you were on? Because it sounds like you were doing this pretty quickly.
I was doing this very quickly. And there was a great sense of relief in doing it. Because, for the last 8 years, like since my brother died, I've been incredibly busy and productive, and I've published a lot and I've written a lot in all kinds of different genres, but there was never a time that I wasn't on some level aware of not writing that book.
Yeah.
There was a sense of feeling like everything I was doing was worthwhile, but also in avoidance of writing this and figuring out how to address this.
Mm.
And so there was a sense of relief in finally doing it. There was an outpouring of emotion in finally doing it. There was part of me couldn't wait to get through it and like race to the finish line and get to the end, whatever that was. And I had no conception of what or where that was.
Hmm.
So there were times in the writing, you know, it's like, okay, I'm 50 pages in. I could be half done. I could turn a corner and suddenly realize that I've come to the end, or I could be 3,000 pages from being done. I really don't know. I don't know where this is going. I don't know what I'm going to feel compelled to pull in next, because there are sort of, there's the main spine of the book, but I sort of tell other stories as well. I'm pulling in all kinds of things. And part of me wanted to get to the end, and part of me wanted to kind of continue doing this forever, because it felt like the most meaningful work I had done in a very long time. So yeah,
and you end the book with saying, I'll never let you go. I mean, there's a part of you that doesn't want to let this go either. You know, this book, I definitely felt that when you were writing it. And to be honest with you, I almost felt like it might have ended too soon for me. You know, it was abrupt in the ending, and I don't know if that was intentional.
It wasn't. I mean, nothing about this book is particularly intentional. Like it's the structure of it, the flow of it, all of that is, I mean, and of course there's a lot of editing that happened after the fact. The book got longer, certain passages got teased out more, got more descriptive or whatever. But I was very conscious of not wanting to mess too much with the rawness of it. So the final form of the book is pretty reflective of the way that I wrote it. Things did not get moved around. The order did not get flipped. And it does end somewhat abruptly. And yet I never wrote past that endpoint. Like that endpoint always was the endpoint. There was never a line after that last line. But I agree with you. I kind of get where I'm going abruptly in a way. And it's not chronological. So the final scene, you know, there's been much of the book that goes the last scene takes place only a year after he dies, and elsewhere in the book I go almost up to the present. So yeah, it kind of came on me suddenly.
Yeah, I have to tell you, this book was very difficult for me to read through, and as many of my listeners know, my brother took his life 5 years ago now, and it's fascinating to me the correlation that we have. You and I having gone to high school together, our brothers, essentially, I'm not sure where they were in relation to each other, but pretty close in age. And, you know, many of the experiences that you have and you reflect on in the book are ones that I completely identify with, in terms of relating as an older sibling, remembering the happy times despite brothers reporting not feeling that happy at the time. And then also the experience that you had subsequent, in terms of meeting up with people who knew you both later on in life and having to navigate those uncomfortable and awkward conversations. Has that gotten easier for you? Did this book make a difference for you in terms of being out in the open in terms of your brother's passing?
It's certainly, yeah, it has. I've gotten a lot of emails from folks since publishing the book, from readers, from people who've been through similar things, and also from quite a few people who knew my brother, some of whom I have not heard from until now. The hardest days for me are, you know, his birthday, and then more so the anniversary of his death. And I started writing, as I said, around his birthday, and I was done shortly before the anniversary of his death. You know, and that's always a day that's incredibly difficult for me. I never know what to do with myself. Whatever choice I make ends up feeling like the wrong one. Like, I'm just going to be alone. And then I'm like, fuck, by 9 a.m. I'm like, why the fuck did I want to be alone? This is a terrible idea. I'm calling people. It's a day that I feel coming a long way away. I start to anticipate it and dread it in a certain kind of way. And when it came that year, when I had just finished this book, it felt dramatically different. I felt like I could face it in a different kind of way. And I've continued to feel that way since. That day doesn't have the same I mean, it's still a heavy day, but it doesn't feel as it did, because I feel like at some level I've done some work and I can face it in a different kind of way. And I mean, also, there's a funny way that all of this feels. The fact that I'm actually like out here talking about him and about his death and about suicide now feels like coming full circle, because when he died, 2 weeks later, Go the Fuck to Sleep was published, and I was suddenly doing an incredible amount of very public stuff. Like, I was on TV all the time and I was doing interviews every day, like all day, every day for the next year, and traveling a ton and around a lot of strangers and new people who I was just gonna have one meal with and then never see again. And I was sort of juggling this private grief and shock with this public, this public performance of joy and success. And so I felt like I was wearing a mask, which made me feel like I was doing just what David had done in a different kind of way. I was hiding what was really going on in the same way he had. And there was part of me that felt good about continuing on. I knew my family wanted me to do all of this. I wasn't about to renege on my commitments to publicize this book. I understood that this was a chance that I was not likely to have again. Lightning doesn't strike twice, and that book, caught fire, and I had to do these things, and it lined up with my ambition, and it lined up with my, desire to demonstrate to my family that, like, if I could go on, we could all go on, life could go on. But there was at the same time a part of me that felt like with each interview I did, with each time I was up on some TV show bantering and smiling, I was somehow betraying my brother, or confirming his beliefs that we would all be okay without him, we would all go on without him, that that his death was for the best. So it was tricky and difficult to do all of that. And I also had this somewhat irrational fear every time I did an interview that this would be the time that somebody like blindsided me with a question about my brother, which doesn't make a whole lot of sense, right? If you're interviewing me at that time, you're interviewing me because I'm the luckiest asshole in the world. I wrote Go the Fuck to Sleep.
Yeah.
Oh, ha ha ha. It's so, Sam.
It's a lighthearted book. We're not into getting deep. Yeah.
Right. Nobody's trying to like pull some gotcha shit on.
Nobody wants you to cry on stage. No.
Yeah, probably not. But my life was bizarre enough that it, while irrational, wasn't utterly out of the, like, it was irrational of me to have that fear, but not 100%, because I did like wake up to find that somebody had like, found a bunch of photos of me like playing basketball with no shirt on and literally published like Go the Fuck to Sleep author, like topless playing basketball. Nobody gave a shit. It's not like that those photos were like widely disseminated, but somebody thought that they would get enough clicks to make that like a thing worth doing, The book was being like banned and fought over in New Zealand. Like crazy shit was happening. So it was irrational, but not completely out of the realm of possibility that some shit like that would have happened. It didn't happen, but I never stopped thinking that it might. So it does feel like I've come full circle now to be like, no, this is actually the thing that I want to talk about. This is the thing I'm here to discuss.
Yeah, there was that really poignant moment in the book with another high school friend who, when you denied his death because of that fear of yours, where you thought, I just can't bring this to light right now at this dinner party.
Yeah. I had been flown to DC to do some kind of like meet and greet cocktail hour by some publicity firm. And the person who brought me had gone to our high school. I didn't actually remember her. I think she was younger than me. She knew my brother, but like, I knew that at some point she was going to ask me about him.
Yeah.
And, I got very good a little bit later at seeing 5 minutes into the future and knowing when a conversation was going to pivot toward family and somebody was going to ask an innocuous question about like, oh, do you have any siblings?
Yeah.
And like figuring out a way to redirect the conversation before it ever got there. But yeah, on this occasion, I knew it was coming. And I didn't know what I was going to do. And when she finally, oh yeah, how's Dave? I was like, oh yeah, he's great. He lives in Brookline with his wife, which felt horrible.
Yeah.
but you also don't want to necessarily derail the dinner party by being like, actually, he killed himself 3 weeks ago.
Yeah. You know, it's so fascinating. As you're speaking, I'm very clear that this book was a therapeutic process for you, that you processed a lot going through this book. And then even subsequent to the book, it sounds like you've still been kind of learning more and more about yourself. And on a certain level, I'm envious of you. I want to sit down and write a book, terrified, but I want to sit down and write a book about my brother. I want to find out, put those concepts together and find those missing links that you said you were kind of discovering as you went through the process. And one of the things you mentioned was this mask that your brother was wearing. And for a while, you had to put on a similar mask. If you're listening to this podcast, chances are you didn't get into business to be miserable. The problem is that people feel that if their business gets busier, if they start becoming more successful, that happiness will eventually set in. But it can actually get worse. This is why I created the Business of Happiness Prosperity Coaching. In this one-on-one coaching, we look at how to redefine success on your terms and re-find the joy and the passion in your dream. Visit me at thebizofhappiness.com and become the happiest business owner you know. Do you still wear a mask of some sort? Is this therapeutic process allowed you the ability to take off that mask, or is there still a mask that you're wearing?
I think the process of the book has definitely helped with that. I mean, I think of that mask specifically as being applicable, as being on my face during the first year or so, when I was like super public, when I was promoting that book, when I was utterly unwilling to tell anybody that he had died. I don't mean that I didn't want them to know. I did. I wanted my friends to know, but I didn't want to have to be the one to tell them because it was so painful to say the words, to register the reaction on people's faces. I think the desire, at least to take the mask off, emerged maybe a couple of years later. There's a time that I think about, that I talk about in the book, that was kind of an inflection point maybe in that process when, I was asked to tell a story for the Moth Storytelling Hour, which is like an NPR show. Folks may have heard the podcast or heard it on the radio, but the way that it is made is it's all live performance. So you get up on a stage in front of, an auditorium full of people and tell a story, and the audio of that ends up on the radio. So the story I was telling, and it happened to be in Boston as well, where I'm from, where we're both from. The story was like, more or less a stand-up routine. It was like a bunch of funny, wacky shit that happened to me around Go the Fuck to Sleep, hosting a fundraiser with Dr. Richard Ferber, the sleep training expert who, proceeds to like throw me under the bus in his presentation. His presentation to a bunch of like rich donors in Los Angeles who couldn't care less about how to put a baby to sleep because they have like staff that does that. And he's like showing this elaborate slideshow. Everybody's drunk. Nobody wants to see this. And then he shows a slide of me from the book sneaking out of a kid's room and is like, this is what you should never do. This is totally wrong. I'm sitting there with I'm like, did Dr. Ferber just throw me under the sleep training bus?
Oh, man.
And then I find out that, and then I go home to my hotel room and I've got an email from Ferber and he's like, why didn't you tell me that I know you? And I'm like, what the fuck is going on? And it turns out that his son and I went to summer camp together and got arrested together when we were 13 and went to Tower Records on Newberry Street, and I ripped the head off a cardboard cutout of MC Hammer, and they grabbed us and like took us into the Tower Records dungeon and told me that the cutout of MC Hammer was worth $5,000, which, seems spurious in retrospect, but at the time I was like, oh my God, how will I ever, and like Dr. Ferber like picked us up and took us home, and he reminded me anyway. So the story was like this very lighthearted story. And
a great one, albeit a great story, but yes, one that was not going to hit you emotionally.
It's a good story. And the night before we were to perform, all the storytellers rehearsed together. So you hear everybody's story and then you go to dinner. And the honesty and the bravery of these other stories made me feel like a fraud and a liar. You know, it's the moth. So typically it's like stories about, you know, pregnancy become stories about Down syndrome. Stories about a marriage turn into stories about like losing a spouse, you know.
Yeah.
They're heavy.
Yeah.
And I felt, you know, I was like, okay, you know, and I went back to my room and I was pacing around in the hotel and I was like, you know, it was one thing to promote the book and present this happy face to the world and be the guy who wrote Go the Fuck to Sleep in the appropriate ways. That was okay. I know why I did that. It feels like quite another thing now, 2-3 years later, to get up and willingly craft this narrative and tell this story that elides the truth. And compared to the honesty and the bravery of these other storytellers, I can't do it. I can't do it. So I'm like knocking on my director's hotel room door at like 10 at night. And she's like, yes, can I help you? And I'm like, I don't want to tell that story. That's not the real story. That's like the bullshit story I've been telling all these years. This is what really happened. I want to, you know, I'm going to rewrite my story. And I had this like heroic vision of myself sitting down that very night and like throwing out the old story and writing the new story, writing the real story, putting it all out there, getting up on stage and like, you know, and she was like, yeah, nah, you're not going to do any of that, my man. Like, you're bugging out right now.
Yeah.
Like
It's going on in a few hours. There's not gonna,
yeah, like we construct these evenings very carefully. Your job is to end it on a high note and be funny so that people go home and like, you know, feel good about their night. Like you're not ready to tell. She was basically like, go the fuck to sleep.
Yeah.
So, you know, so I did. And I told that story. And then I like told that story like probably 24 more times on other stages. But when I look back, I think it wasn't the first time I thought about telling the story, but it was the first time maybe that that mask, you know, slips, or that I start wrestling with it and trying to take it off and feeling conflicted about presenting that face to the world.
Yeah. Fascinating. You know, it's interesting, this idea of a mask and in terms of our perception of happiness. And, you know, it sounds to me like the more that you're speaking about it is that you're understanding that recognition of your true authenticity when you take off the mask as being a release, like a weight off your shoulders. And maybe, dare I say, kind of an appreciation of the truth as opposed to something that we're putting on a facade. And it's interesting that your brother was so concerned about it that that's what took his life, essentially, was that wearing of that mask.
Yeah, that's certainly one way to look at it. Certainly one way that I look at it in the book. I mean, a lot of the book is me looking at various things in various ways without knowing which is the right one, putting out ideas and just as quickly rejecting them. And, you know, part of that I think is because I'm wrestling with the desire to tell his story and my story while also wrestling with a resistance to claiming the authority to do so.
Yeah.
Understanding that there are things that are unknowable, that I'm lucky enough not to understand the mind state of somebody who doesn't want to be alive. And that if you tell a story, even if you don't fully believe that story, even if you try at every turn to suggest the alternate possibilities, the other narratives, the shadow narratives, the more you tell the story, the more you kind of consecrate that story. That path gets trampled down and it becomes the singular narrative. And so, you know, I'm trying to write the book without allowing the book to become the singular narrative. So I'm sort of always undercutting myself and putting out an idea only to say, no, probably not. But an idea that I do find compelling and inescapable, as you say, is the idea that on some level, my brother's unwillingness to tell his own story is as much the thing that killed him as his depression. And when I think about my own children, you know, I can't control the brain chemistry they inherit, but what I do hope is to be able to destigmatize anything they might be going through and imbue them with the language, the ability to claim the language to articulate whatever it is that they are going through and not feel that they need to hide or be ashamed or feel guilty or feel like a burden or any of these things that my brother seems to have felt. And I'm perplexed as to how he got there. It's one of the many things I want to understand, particularly because depression is not something unfamiliar in our family. We've got grandparents and cousins and uncles and all kinds of folks who have struggled with it. Not to this degree and this magnitude, of course, but like perhaps enough so that there was maybe a belief in the family that depression is like something you live with rather than something that can in fact kill you.
It's interesting because as you say that, I think there's also a lot to be said in terms of the respect of allowing our brothers the respect to take that charge in their life, make that decision. I think previous generations might have felt like they have to just persevere, martyr themselves to live with depression, whereas our brothers took the stance to make a change, to do something about it. I don't know. It's an unpopular feeling, an unpopular theory, but in some regard, they took control of their lives.
Yeah, that's certainly one way to look at it.
Yeah, it's interesting. In terms of wearing that mask, I just keep coming back to that. It's so fascinating to me. What advice would you have for other people who are feeling that way? Taking you back to that year when you had that great notoriety after the publishing of Go the Fuck to Sleep, and you were feeling this, duality of knowing what you felt like inside and then having to put on a certain persona. And it was a requirement, not just a survival skill at the time, but for your profession, for your career, it was important to do that. What advice would you give for anyone feeling in that situation? Is it just time?
I think it's partly time. I don't know. I mean, I think there are a lot of kinds of masks that one can wear. Another thing I talk about in the book is kind of the idea of the mask as reflective of double consciousness, whether that's W.E.B. Du Bois's notion of what it is to be Black in America. I connect it to Jews throughout history and the knowledge of the self and the other, the ability to know yourself while also knowing how the world views you, that kind of thing. Not all masks, I think, are bad masks. We all code switch, we all flip switches and go from one thing to another. It's a survival skill. And, it's funny, I was doing an event last night and talking to a very good friend of mine, the writer Daniel Alarcon, who's the first person who read this book when I was, halfway through it. And, we were talking about masks and what it made me remember is that, this was a skill, if you want to call it that I've had since I was like a little kid, a skill I wish in many ways I didn't have, but the ability to, in my case, walk out of a screaming match with my parents and kind of like readjust and reformulate and become an entirely different person in the time it took to like walk to the end of the driveway and get in a car, get picked up to go to school or get picked up to go somewhere, or like, I was already doing the same thing in essence. We do it because we have to survive, but I think if we lose control of the ability to take it on and off, if we lose perspective on like what's the mask and what isn't, that's very dangerous. I think that telling our stories and integrating ourselves or the different aspects and sides of ourselves is incredibly important. And I feel better, I was about to say I feel better walking around without a mask on, but now I'm walking around with a mask on, as we all are.
Absolutely.
Certainly nothing I anticipated when I wrote, it's funny because, the notion of the mask, pandemic masks were not in my consciousness when I wrote this. And it's also funny to publish the book in 2021 when a lot of the things about suicide that, for me anyway, are very isolating, are maybe much more widely applicable, right? Because one of the things that's tricky about suicide is that it estranges you even from a lot of the like rituals and platitudes that surround death. A
Yeah.
lot of the things that people do and say when a loved one dies don't fully apply. Like, how do you celebrate the life of somebody who ended it themselves?
Yeah.
How do you mourn somebody who made a decision to leave? You know, these things make it very difficult. And in 2020 and 2021, everybody who's lost somebody has been forcibly distanced from a lot of the rituals. Like, so many people have not been able to attend a funeral, not been able to sit shiva, not been able to give somebody a hug. So in a funny kind of way, both the mask idea, the literalization of the mask idea, and the estrangement from rituals around death are both things that like everybody's kind of dealing with right now. It's kind of a weird thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I even equated to when you were speaking earlier about how it took you 3 weeks to write the book, but actually 8 years. Essentially, it took you 43 years to write the book because it was all your experiences that brought you to that point to be able to deliver it in the manner that you did. You were talking about the people you had met along the journey and the experiences in terms of music and poetry. It really took you that long. It had to wait that long to be written.
Yeah, that's true. That's
Mm,
true. And
yeah.
it's a good reminder because I tend to always be pushing. I tend to always be like, why, like I should be doing more. But yeah, things take as long as they take.
There was a certain divine timing there. Yeah. Even in terms of the pandemic, if you will see it that way. But so what's next for you? What's the next? This feels like such a poignant book. It's hard to reach deep down into Adam Mansbach and pull out something more insightful or more deep. But maybe that's just my naivety. What's up in your future? Something that is burning a hole in your pen.
It's interesting. I mean, one thing that this book I think did a couple of things for me. It kind of cleared the pipeline in terms of making me feel open to taking on more serious work, more weighty work. I mean, in the last 8 years, I've published humor books that I wrote with Dave Barry and Alan Zweibel. I've written screenplays that became movies. I've written 5 middle grades books. I've written 2 thrillers, but I've not written a literary novel that requires me to like really dig super deep. I've not taken on other kinds of work that really stretch and push me. And now I think with this book out of the way, I feel more open to those things. But also the other thing it does is make me feel better about the balance of my work life. It makes me feel not guilty about the lighter, more kind of fun shit that I do. So all that to say that the next 2 things from me, one is a movie that I'm writing for New Line that we sold to New Line a few months ago. It's a comedy called Super High, a stoner superhero comedy called Super High. It stars Andy Samberg, Craig Robinson, and Common. So I'm writing that, which is a lot of fun.
Awesome.
And it's also super fun to be writing for those guys. It's when you're writing a comedy in particular, knowing who your actors are and being able to play to their strengths is remarkably fun. Like, it's like being, the point guard on a basketball team. The more you write and the more you work with them and the more you get notes from them and talk everything through, the more you understand everybody's strengths. You're like, oh, right, Craig is left-handed and he likes to get the ball at the top of the key, or like, oh yeah, Andy likes to go back door, whatever it is. So that's super fun. Craig is somebody I've known a long time. I've written 3 books with Craig. Andy, I met in the course of this project, but he's the guy that I'm probably working most closely with. And it's super fun. His notes and his input are great, but also we come from like a similar place. Like, we're both white Jewish dudes who have been rhyming and into hip hop since the 80s. And a lot comes with that. Like, a lot of memories and touch points come with that, but also like a particular critical race consciousness and critique of white supremacy come with that, because you weren't really allowed to participate if you didn't have those things. Like, you weren't really welcome if you couldn't do that. So, you know, there are days when like I'm texting with him about some joke in the script and tweaking it. And then there are days when like, you know, we just start texting about like Redman, you know, and trading like our favorite Redman lyrics. So that's super fun.
That's great.
And that movie, I think ought to be probably out in 2022 sometime, assuming assuming I get it in on time. And then the other thing I'm working on right now, I mean, I'm always working on like 12 things, but another thing I'm working on right now is another book that is in this same kind of format. Like, I really found that like book as long poem concept very, very liberating and easy to work in. So I'm writing something else in that form that's very different. It's kind of about race in Boston during the 80s and into the mid 90s. Like basically from about the time I was in third grade to about, 94 when, I leave. And it's like, it's a memoir, but it also has, it's also an attempt to connect my memories to sort of like the larger touchstones and the larger picture of like what was happening. So it's everything from, the Metco program and the history of the Metco program to,
Rodney King happened in that time.
Rodney King, Willie Horton, Len Bias, like, I mean, all kinds of stuff. And, sort of woven in with like my own personal stuff. So yeah, I'm sort of working on that, like when I get a break from like all of the like other, like screenwriting and TV projects that I'm also doing at the same time. So,
something I absolutely love about you in this conversation is just the passion that you exude. I can tell when you get excited about something, when you talk about what you love, you just light up. It's really beautiful to see, which is a tribute to your craft as well, because it seems like you've just fallen into a niche or maybe worked your way towards it. I should give you more credit than that, but you've worked your way towards just this beautiful purpose for yourself. And it's so cool to see. So thank you. Thank you for your courage to bring this forward and to keep pursuing it, even despite the years when you were feeling like you were wearing a mask, when you weren't feeling your authentic self. Thank you for continuing to pursue it despite the discomfort, despite those difficult emotions, because I think so many of us hold ourselves back when we're in those uncomfortable places and we don't pursue what lights us up, and therein is the gift.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. Yeah, no, I'm very lucky. Like I love what I do. I'm a polymath when it comes to writing, so there are a lot of things that sort of cross my desk, and they're all interesting. And no matter what they are, I've got to like restrain myself from saying yes to everything, because it's like, oh yeah, like sure, I could probably figure out how to do that. Like, that sounds fun. I don't know shit about that, but I'd love to like figure out the rules of that and give it a shot. Yeah.
That's awesome. So what would you say your superpower is?
My superpower. It's interesting you mentioned superpowers, because what this movie is about is these three guys who get their hands on this weed that gives you superpowers. But the thing about it is you get different powers every time. A lot of them are like really shitty. Like the first time Craig smokes weed, he can fly, but only 6 inches off the ground. So and it's like very labor intensive and dangerous to even figure out what your powers are a lot of the time. So I don't know. I don't know that I have. I mean, shit. I don't know. My superpower. I don't know. I'm gonna have to think about that one.
It's so funny because I could probably name 10 of yours, even not after having not spoken to you for almost 30 years. I think I already know a few. Well, what do you think is the definition of happiness?
Um, for me, the first things that come to mind are a certain kind of freedom. Um, Feeling free, whatever that means. For me, feeling free means that my time is my own and the things I'm able to pursue are things that I care about, that I spend very little of my time doing shit that doesn't matter to me. That might be writing, it might be hanging out with my kids or my partner or seeing my friends, but you know, very little of my time is spent in ways that I don't find enriching and worthwhile. Um, so I think for me, freedom and love and support. Like I think that, you know, for me, getting through all of this, you know, I didn't really rely on formal support structures. It wasn't therapy, it wasn't a survivors group of any kind. Not that there's anything wrong with those things. There's a lot that's great about those things, and I probably need a therapist, but more than anything else, it was my community. You know, I feel very, very lucky to have the kind of friends and family that I can rely on and that I am reliable for, you know, that really, that I think that's probably a bigger factor in my happiness than anything else. Feeling like the people in my life are folks that I trust, love, can rely on, can laugh with. And I think also my last, I could keep going on this forever, but I think laughter is incredibly important to me. You know, the ability to find the humor in anything that's probably my superpower, is the ability to find the humor, to find the joke in whatever the shit is that I'm dealing with. Even in this, you know, unremittingly like dark and emotionally grueling book, there are jokes, there are moments of levity, there are observations that, to me at least, are funny. And they're not tacked on, and I didn't think of them later. They're mostly things that I thought even in the moment, that even as I was going through like those things, you can't really turn off the part of your brain that finds the humor. At least I wouldn't want to try. There's a story that my co-writer Alan Zweibel tells that to me encapsulates something about the essence of humor. He, you know, Alan's in his early 70s. He was a writer on Saturday Night Live for the first 6 years of the show. So he goes a long ways back, and he used to write at the Friars Club, like legendary New York City haunt for like writers. You know, Milton Berle is holding court in there. All kinds of old school guys were in there when Alan was in there writing. Ed Sullivan, you know.
Wow.
And the story Alan tells is that one day he's walking out the front door of the Friars Club, and about 6 feet in front of him is Henny Youngman, right? Legendary comedian, the king of the one-liners. Henny Youngman is alone. Henny Youngman walks out of the club, walks down the sidewalk, and a pigeon lands in front of him. And Henny Youngman, without missing a beat, bends down and says to the pigeon, "Any mail for me?" And, you know, to me, the thing about that story to me is like, Henny Youngman's alone. He's not performing.
No one else is watching. Yep.
It's just him and the bird, you know? And to me, it's like, that's comedy. That's the muscle reflex. Like when the joke comes, you make the joke no matter what. And no matter if there's anybody there to appreciate it, because if you don't, the other jokes might get backed up behind it.
Yeah. And that's the truth. And that's the truth in any creative pursuit. I think you just got to act on it. Yeah. So before I ask you my final question here, my friend, and thank you again for this wonderful hour that you've spent with me. I really do appreciate it. I know your time is valuable, so I'm grateful to you.
My pleasure.
It's so good. I know. I wish I would chat with you for hours. I have so many more things to say. But before I ask you our final question, how can my audience find your book? How can we find you? How can we find more of your incredible works? It will all be in the show notes for everybody who wants to look it up, but let us know.
Yeah. I appreciate that. You know, I'm pretty easy to find. The book is available at your local independent bookstore or, you know, your corporate behemoth
Yeah.
bookseller if you so desire. Yeah, the book is called I Had a Brother Once. It's published by One World, which is a division of Random House. They tend to get their books in bookstores. So, you know, whether you're doing your online shopping at bookshop.org, which is a good way of staying indie even without leaving your house, or anywhere else you might want to find a book, or the audiobook as well, which is available from audible.com. Which, you know, that you might have to like
Yeah.
well, you'll figure.
You have to pay Audible for that one. But I highly recommend it. It's a beautiful experience. So thank you.
Yeah. Beyond that, you know, I have a website. It's adammansbach.com. Adam Mansbach is my handle on the various social media channels. Not that you'll find anything on, you know, if you follow me on Twitter, you'll see me talking about like 80s hip hop with like the other 15 old heads that I communicate with on Twitter. I might make a joke every once in a while, like, you know, beware, be warned.
Be prepared. Got it. So the final question, Adam, and this one will come as a little bit of a dagger to the gut. If I were to take all these incredible works that you've created and have them disappear, if everything you've written were to go away and you could leave, I know you have some beautiful children, your daughter, if you could leave your daughter with a message, what would that final message be? Something that she can take with her into her life.
Yeah. I've actually got 3 daughters.
All 3 of them are daughters. I wasn't sure. Oh my gosh. Well, then there you go. You can picture all 3 of them as you say this.
What would I leave my kids with? Probably some variation on what I just said about laughing, about surrounding yourself with good people. You know, the older I get and the more I sort of look back on how I got here and how other folks got where they are and the paths we take and the decisions we make, the more convinced I am that probably the most important skill you can develop is the ability to judge people. Like, and it's so intuitive and it happens at such a young age, but it impacts everything going forward. Like when I talk to my now 13-year-old daughter, who's about to like go from a little tiny school to a much bigger school and a much bigger world, the thing I want most for her, because I think it kind of dictates everything else, is really the ability to decide like, this person is the one I should be friends with. And that one is probably not. Like, I feel like that judgment echoes forward in your life so profoundly. Like, you know, the instincts I had about who my friends should be and who like was a good person and a you know, enriching person. Yeah, that's like one of the most, to me, that's like the essential skill that kind of like dictates so much about your life.
And where does that come from? Is that just intuitive, or is
And
that it?
I wish I knew.
Yeah.
I really wish I knew. I don't know how you teach somebody that. I don't know how you teach them that judgment, particularly when you're like, you know, talking about like a bunch of 5-year-olds or something.
Yeah. Or even 13. My son is 15 and man, I can't even get his head to slow down for 1 minute, let alone the testosterone pumping through his body at this moment. But it's very hard for him to get in touch with his intuition. But I can see that. I can see that in the relationship building throughout your lifetime, coloring and shaping who you are.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. Beautiful. Well, thank you, my friend. It is so great to see you after all these years. And I appreciate your vulnerability and your honesty. And more than anything, I thank you for just pursuing this passion of yours and for gifting all of us the beauty of your works.
Yeah, no, it's my pleasure. And it's really good to see you next time in person, hopefully.
That sounds good. Sounds good. And thank you so much to all of you for joining us today. As I mentioned, you can find all of those links to find these spectacular works from Adam Mansbach in the show notes. And until next time, today is going to be a great day. Bye-bye.